I first learned of Aidan Hart from his publishing, but of course, you know, you're an iconographer. You're a very well-known iconographer with you know, works in over 25 countries over in the world, in Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Anglican cathedrals, and in monasteries. I read this. This is a direct quote from, I believe, your website, but it was so beautiful. I had to kind of throw this in the bio. You know, your passion is to create works and church interiors that reflect something of the beauty of life in Christ and help people experience that union of heaven and earth. And that is the ultimate purpose of liturgical art. You have published numerous articles on the works of iconography, ecology, Orthodox spirituality. In 2009, you founded and you still teach the part-time icon certificate program for the Prince's Foundation School of Traditional Arts, and a number of, you know, to meet the growing demands you have. You know, the number is 1,200 commissioned works in private and church collections. You have you work with a team of highly skilled craftspeople, you know, people like Dr. James Blackstone, Martin Earl. We're all very excited to hear what you have to say for us today. And while we're on Zoom, we can't quite give you the applause that you well deserve, but know that we are all very excited to hear what you have to say today. With that being said, please, Mr. Aidan Hart.
Thank you, Dima, and Laura for inviting me today. You're very blessed people to live in Boston. I visited it once in 1983. It's a very beautiful city. So in thinking about what to emphasize today, I thought we could talk about all the visual liturgical arts as a unity. Certainly in this country, right across the board, not just Orthodox, but Anglicans and Catholics have got very interested in panel icons. So when you use the word icon, people tend to think of the panel, which is great. It's a good beginning. You have exhibitions of them. But we mustn't forget that the panel icon is part of a whole liturgical symphony or a sacred dance, if you like, i.e. the liturgy. So I wanted to concentrate today on how the different elements should come together, the architecture. And of course, the architecture influences the acoustics, you know, how the singing and the preaching is heard. The architecture affects the state of our soul, different shapes have different effects on us. Then, of course, you've got the wall, what's on the walls, the frescoes, mosaics, whatever. Even the furnishings take up a big part. The Sevilla, if it's a monastery, and the icon screen, all these things have an impact on you. So I want to look at the whole, how these things work together. So I'm going to go into screen share now, so you can see the slides I've got here, and we'll go through those bit by bit. So I want to start with the sort of theology. You know, why is our liturgy made of so many parts? Why are there so many choristers? Why are there so many instruments in this liturgy? Because, of course, the more extreme Protestant, the Calvinists, would just say word is enough. Just have the spoken word. We don't want any of this physical stuff that would get in the way. Out of interest, this is the chapel where I was actually this morning. I spent 3 days with 4 of my students teaching them mosaic. This is a chapel that I made entirely from scratch. It was actually a barn which kept animals. So it was half underground, so I converted it into a chapel. People often say, you know, beauty can be expensive. Well, the materials on this particular chapel cost me about £300. Most of the wood's recycled. Obviously, I had to spend a lot of time fashioning things, but beauty can be, doesn't have to cost a lot. I think you just need to believe that it's important, and you find a way one way or the other within one's budget. So let's look at this sort of theological principles of the liturgy, and particularly why the material world is so important. I remember I became Orthodox through 2 monks in New Zealand, and I didn't know anything about Orthodoxy, and I visited them for a weekend. And Father Ambrose, the priest, was showing me around, and he showed me all the things on the altar, you know, the chalice and various things. And this monk, this man of prayer, said to me, "Oh, I love things. I love matter." And at first, I thought, oh, you know, that's a shocking thing to hear. But I realized later what he meant, that it was through things that God often comes to us. Of course, the Lord ultimately came to us through becoming flesh. But I think in our modern age, which is materialistic, we tend to think that matter gets in the way. Get matter out of the way, and there's my spirit and God's spirit. But of course, that's not the Christian way. So let's look at some of the principles behind the liturgy. We're created in God's image, and God is Trinity. It says, of course, in Genesis, let us make man in our image. So God is speaking as three there. So to be in God's image is to be in communion. So to be in God's image is relationship. It's not me as an individual in God's image so much. It's Aidan Hart in relationship with Dima and Laura and Maggie. And this is really fundamental. So our worship should reflect this sort of unity and diversity, as it were. We think of unity, but there's a danger of thinking of unity as oneness. But we notice here in Pentecost that each person is unique. And of course, the Holy Spirit came down upon them singly. A flame of fire went on each one individually. And of course, they spoke in different languages. And you see here, each face is different. They had different names, different garments. They all share the blue, which is the Holy Spirit they've received. So that's another important point, that to be in God's image is to be in relationship. To be in relationship means you've got to be true to yourself. That union with God brings out our true name, as it were. And I refer to this in terms of different media. Like, I think it's a mistake if someone making a mosaic tries to make it look like a painting. You've got to work within the limits of your medium and discover the name of that medium. So all these are theological principles that have an impact on how we make. So this is the church I go to. I was just telling Dima earlier that this church is actually on an 8th century foundation, founded as part of a convent founded by a saint. And you can see the scrolls on the wall. They're dated about 1380. On the other side is a fresco. But here you can see lots of different things. You've got the fragrance, so the scents, of course, they're the icons which we kiss, so these touch. Here communion is being given so that all the senses are used. But all these should work together. And I think quite often we as Orthodox have failed in this. We sort of put individual bits in, but we don't think of the whole enough. Andrew Gold is a great architect, and he's very, very good at ensuring that everything's working together, the acoustics, the shapes, the materials, being true to the local architecture. All these things are important. So liturgy isn't just a static thing. We're not just sort of doing the same thing every Sunday. The whole of the age to come is moving in a direction toward the New Jerusalem. On the right here, you see a fresco just finished recently. It's for a Catholic church. But I sort of drew on early Orthodox, especially Roman mosaics. On the left here, you have St. Placida. So what I found fascinating about these early Roman mosaics is that you're facing east and you see Christ, but you notice that above Christ, you normally have these sunrise-colored clouds. So why do we have that? It's because we're looking not just at Christ with us now, but also Christ coming to us out of the future, his glorious second coming. So hence, he's rising like the sun in the future, and so you get these sunrise-colored clouds. And then you notice above my fresco at the top, you've got the cross. It's a bejeweled cross. And Christ said, you'll see the sign of the Son of Man coming in the skies before I return. So liturgical art should always be moving us forward. Christ is present, but also we're moving toward the New Jerusalem. You can't see it, but behind the brick arch on the left is Bethlehem, with the sheep coming out of Bethlehem, and on the right is Jerusalem. So Bethlehem and Jerusalem aren't just the beginning and the end of Christ's life on earth, but it's the beginning of creation and the culmination of creation in the marriage, as it were, of the bride and the bridegroom, the descent of the New Jerusalem to earth. Part of this sort of union of the present and the future is the fact that Christ rose on a Sunday. Now, the Sunday, of course, is an 8th day. The Sabbath is the Saturday. So Christ didn't enter the 7-day cycle of created time and then rise within it. He rose and opened up the 7-day cycle into eternity, into the 8th day. This is the floor of the Hermitage Chapel, which I made. And you notice here the shapes. I'll show you more glorious versions of that. This is just made out of wood. But you notice that in the beginning, there's a square, which symbolizes the created world, the four elements, the four corners of the earth. But in the middle, you've got a square with a circle in the middle. And that circle is divinity. And you notice that there are four circles going into the corners. So that's the Lord enters the creation, and the gospel is sent into the four corners of the world. But also there are 8 circles there all together. So God enters created time and opens it up to eternity. And all these things are an important part of the liturgy. We need to have this bigger picture in mind. We're not just making little icons, painted icons for me and my Jesus. We're actually in this incredible journey. We're part of this enormous pilgrimage of millions of saints have gone before us. So I'd like to finish the theological part before we go into some of the practical elements by looking at 3 roles that all of us are called to, and that's the priestly, the royal, and finally the prophetical. So what is it to be priestly? This is an amazing mosaic in just outside of Ravenna in Italy, at a Apollinarian class. So this is a wonderful mosaic that shows us what the priestly role of every person is. Of course, you get particular priests, like this is Saint Apollinarius in the middle, raising his hands in prayer. So we have particular people ordained to the priesthood, but all of us are called to be priests as well. What's interesting here, it's actually the Transfiguration, that through his prayer, all around becomes offered up to God. All the trees are slightly transfigured. When you look up close, there's this sort of slightly gold effect around the trees and the rocks. Everything is offered to God and becomes more than just a stone or a tree. It becomes an expression of God's love to us. And if you carve wood, I carve wood, and that wood is transformed into a prayer of praise, not with words, but in wood. So the actual making of liturgical art is itself a priestly act. A priest offers, that's the main role of a priest. So I don't as a painter, just look at a lump of azurite, but I grind it up, make it into pigment, and then combine it with other pigments and make it an icon. So I'm taking, as it were, words from the dictionary that God has given to us, but I don't just look at the words in the dictionary. I take them out, make them into a poem of praise. So it's not just the use of liturgical art, but the making of it, which is part of our, as it were, cosmic hymn of praise to God, our priestly role. So we discussed the priestly. Let's look at the prophetical. This is, of course, an icon of Moses and the burning bush. Now, I think that it wasn't so much the bush that changed and caught fire, as it were, with divine fire, but the bush had always been burning with God's presence. It says in the book of Hebrews that he upholds all things by the word of his power. So God doesn't just create, he sustains things, keeps them in existence, and directs them toward the age to come. So what changed really was Moses. God opened Moses' eyes to see the bush as it always is, aflame with God's presence. So this is one of the roles of liturgical art, to reveal the world, not just in its outer physical form, but reveal the inner logos, reveal the presence of God in that thing. So even the way you do mountains, you notice here in this icon, the mountains are sweeping upwards. The mountains are reflecting Moses reaching up toward God, and likewise God's descent to the Israelites by giving them the law. And so then we have the prophetical, the priestly, and then the what I call the sorry, I missed one here. Yeah. Okay. So so let's get into the practical things. How are these sort of prophetical, priestly, and royal roles expressed? I thought I would look at a particular monastery. I was a novice monk for quite a few years, and before becoming a hermit, I was sent to Mount Athos for about a year and a half, and went to this monastery of Aveyron. So the art of worship in this fullest sense has been highly developed, of course, in monasteries like this. So I thought I'd use this as an exemplar. But though you have rather glorious churches like this, which are probably more fancy than most of our parish churches could afford, nonetheless, the principles are the same, like my little hermitage, operated on the same principles, but without all the shiny brass and gold. So I want to sort of go through how this vision is expressed in the liturgy in its fullest way, not just the words, but in the matter, as it were. So let's look at the church architecture itself. The early church started with the basilica, which is actually just a Roman secular building. So when we needed churches quickly, Constantine just basically made churches out of basilicas, which are basically a rectangle with an apse on one end. But by about the 6th century, we began to devise purpose-built churches, and I'll go through the main parts of that. So you can see that basically what we now tend to think of as an Orthodox Church is effectively a cube surmounted by a drum, surmounted by a dome, and then there's an apse. So let's look at the symbolism going from the top down and then west toward east. All this is important because the church itself is an icon. We tend to think of icons, as I've said, just as panels, but in fact, the word icon is much richer than that. So the church itself is an icon. So we'll see what I mean by that. So in the dome, generally, but not always by any means, you have Christ the Pantocrator. Think of him as the conductor of the cosmic orchestra. So he's at the top. But God doesn't just stay up in heaven, he comes down to earth. So you've got the apse, and normally, not always, the Mother of God is there. So the apse is like the womb. God doesn't just stay in heaven, he comes to earth through the Mother of God, depicted in the apse. Very often below, as you see here, you've got the apostles. So they're like the first bishops, if you like. So God becomes man 2,000 years ago, but then he doesn't just pop up to heaven and then we just have to think about that event 2,000 years ago. He comes to us in every liturgy through the apostolic succession. So if the camera, as it were to carry on down, of course, you come to the altar, wouldn't you? And then if it turned round to face west, you see the people. So God and man are coming together, which is our next move. So God starts from the top. You see the picture on the right. God starts from the top. He comes down through the prophets first, often in the drum. You've got the first created angels, and then you've got the prophets. So God begins to, as it were, incarnate himself through the words of the prophets. Then he comes to earth. So you've got the scenes from his Christ's life on earth, and then he's crucified and resurrected and ascended, and so hence he comes to us through the Holy Liturgy. That's what God does. What do? We come from the west and move east, ultimately to be deified. And liturgical art, you can see here the frescoes. This is a church from Russia, which in fact was blown up by the Nazis, but fortunately people photographed and did paintings of the interior before that. So the image on the left is watercolor. So we know what this church was like. So what's our journey from west toward east? And again, each stage is actually an icon that has an impact on our soul. So if you're walking to Mount Athos, even the path before you enter the monastery is part of your movement towards deification. Nowadays, sadly, people tend to drive to the monasteries. I really believe that walking is important because it's a bit of struggle, helps you to sort of get rid of worldly cares, prepares you before you even enter the monastery itself. But once you're in the monastery, you've got a courtyard. Now, it's interesting that most early churches, up to about the end of the first millennium, roughly, had what's called an atrium. So it's a bit like the Western sort of colonnaded courtyards, which now are sort of on the side, the cloister. We tend to have cloisters on the side of the church, but the early church had a cloister, effectively, an atrium, on the west side. So you never went straight from the street into church. You would go through this courtyard, which was half enclosed, it was colonnaded, but there's no roof, so it was half outside. So the courtyard here is part of that. So already you're beginning to move toward the altar. So the next stage is the narthex. If you're lucky, there might be an exonarthex. In Iveron, it's interesting, you had depicted there the last 3 Psalms. So there it depicts all creation praising God, sun and moon and stars and light. So already you're thinking, wow, if inanimate creation is praising God, I'd better get my act together instead of grumbling and forgetting God. I'd better follow the example of the created world. So the next stage is the narthex. These are generally quite dark. There are not many windows, and that's a place of purification, of interiority. So in the early church, if you're a catechumen, you would stay here, you wouldn't be allowed into the nave. If you'd been excommunicated, you were still expected to go to church, but you'd stay there, still partaking as much as possible in the ceremonies, but not taking communion. So this was a place of repentance, purification. So here, the point I'm making is that liturgical art is part of a whole symphony, and each player, in this case, each part of a church, has a different role. And a good liturgical artist will know the role of his or her work, and make sure it's designed with the right materials, use the right imagery, has a style, if you like, a form that helps create that effect in people's souls. Then, of course, we come to the nave. This is the nave of a Veron monastery. I like to think of the nave as paradise. Paradise is where God walked with Adam and Eve. God comes down to earth and walks. And paradise is a Persian word, and it really was a walled park where the king, the emperor, would enjoy life with his family and friends. So it wasn't just a garden. It was an environment for communion between the king and his people and friends. So all this purification, all this preparation is so we can enter paradise and there enjoy communion with one another and with God. So this is why light's important. A lot of reflected light. In Mount Athos, we don't have electricity. Everything's with candlelight, and as we'll discuss later, at high points the candle chandeliers will be swung. So the liturgy there is not just the singing; it's these real dynamic movement that go into this. So going back to this, that's pretty glorious, isn't it? That here we come to my humble little chapel that I painted. So still, a small place can be a paradise. So it's not so much to do with how much money you've got to spend. In fact, bling can actually attract too much attention to itself. So this is quite humble. There's not really anything shiny there, a bit of gold in the background of the icons, but most of this is made out of dirt, basically. These are real frescoes, painted on wet plaster. So basically you're limited to natural earth colors. But using earth, you can create a little paradise. And I've got some wonderful stories to tell of people who've gone into that, secular people who've gone into that little chapel. It's tiny. And they cried, they've said, I've not seen anything like this. It's spoken the language of the soul. So we had the icon screen. In fact, icon screens are a fairly novel thing for the Orthodox Church. They only introduced icon screens, as distinct from screens, about roughly 1100, 1000, 1100, something like that. You always had a screen. Icons initially were actually put along the top, and then only later were they put in between the pillars. This is an icon screen I made for a church in Amsterdam. So apart from the two central icons, I painted all the others, but designed and carved the stone icon screen. I talked earlier, right in the beginning, about unity with God. Brings out the distinction of individuals. So you see the carvings along the bottom here. This parish, though it's ostensibly a Russian parish, in fact had lots of different nations in it. The assistant priest was Dutch himself, but they had Georgians, they had English people, all sorts. So you can see the different designs at the bottom. All those reflect the different cultures that are represented there. So that's an example of unity and diversity. And then, of course, you've got the royal doors. This is a good example of how liturgical art is there to be used, not just looked at. So the doors are literally doors, they open and close. So, of course, there, because they are between, as it were, heaven and earth, they either have the Annunciation, because God came to us through the Incarnation, but also God comes to us through the Holy Liturgy. So often you'd have Basil and St. John Chrysostom, who wrote our liturgies, or sometimes the four evangelists, because it's through Christ's life on earth that God comes to us. Out of interest, this I made myself, and it's actually a folding iron screen. It's a church in Cambridge, Britain, which is owned by the Anglican Church, and they still use it. But the Orthodox we're allowed to use it on condition that the icon screen can be removed after each Orthodox service, so it can be returned to how it was before. So I haven't got a photograph, but our design is to fold up. So in fact, in about 30 seconds, the whole lot folds up off to the side. So I designed this to fit in with what exists. You can just see on the right there some raw time. That's part of the original Anglican Church. So that's why I decided to design. And some of the colors and the designs down below are drawn from what already existed in that church. So we come finally to the sanctuary and the altar. So God becomes flesh and comes to us who are in the nave through the altar. I carved this for my parish church. I mentioned that our parish church was made about 800, more 8th century, I think. And it was connected to a convent about 20 miles away. And the ruins of that convent still exist. So some of the ideas for the columns are from that convent. So I'm drawing here on the early British iconographic tradition. We have a lot of Greeks or Cypriots in our parish, so the centre is more influenced by that Byzantine work. But all of the stone is local, certainly from Britain. The red and the yellow is I think, mined, quarried within about 40 miles. The white stone is Portland, that's further down in England. So I love the idea of our liturgical art being an offering of what's local. It's not, sometimes you got to import stuff, but I love the idea that it's an offering, not just of us humans, us Christians, but it's an offering of earth itself. It's an offering of pigment and stone from that place. Some research was done on pigments used by fresco painters in the church in Russia, and they found that virtually all the pigments were found within about 20, 30 miles, which is wonderful. You know, they actually use local things. The ambo is quite important. I mean, this is a very simple church, but you've got in front of the royal doors a little curve there. Normally it's a raised part. So the ambo, in a sense, is where heaven and earth actually touch, where they kiss, as it were, because that's where we receive communion. That's where the word of God is preached, and we receive that word. So the ambo is quite important. And early churches, actually, it came out a long way, right into the center of the church. But we think of floors just as a place to walk on, but this floor here is, again, we're going to revere on. This is what's called a cosmati floor. I showed you that wooden floor that I made. This is a more glorious version of it. So I love this idea that liturgical art isn't just depicting Christ and the saints, but also the inanimate world, stone in this case, and the abstract world, even the mathematical world, can be made articulate in the praise of God. So here we just got perfect geometry, circles and squares, and within those you've got all sorts of complicated shapes. So here the whole geometrical world is being used in the praise of God. Dima and I were just talking about his music. Well, music is basically just mathematical, isn't it? You're creating formulae, as it were. Notes are just sounds with gaps in between, just like a mathematical formula is. So I just love the fact that this floor, and the abbot, Father Vasilius, used to say, I've thought the part of Malay Orla. This floor tells you everything. Just look at the floor. You can learn everything from this floor. And it's made of really hard stone, but it's been there about 1,000 years. It's sort of been worn unevenly. So when the light shines on it, you can see that it's become sort of wave-like. And you realize it's like that because literally millions of footsteps have gone over that, going to pray. Either that might be the cantor goes from left to right, intoning the verses sung by the choir, or the faithful going up to the icon screen. You're looking at history. You're looking at people's pilgrimage, as it were, embedded in that stone, that has left their mark upon that stone, and you can see that in the waves. So an important thing for liturgical artists is that what they make is functional. A lot of churches, sadly, Orthodox churches, they might be made to look roughly like an Orthodox church. So they'll slap a dome on, slap an arch, and think, well, it's Orthodox now. But the acoustics are terrible often. And when you look at some fantastic research has been done on Hagia Sophia and on 8 traditional churches in Thessaloniki, and they realized how fantastically clever and knowledgeable these architects were. They could get amazing acoustics, not just for the sung word, but also for the spoken, because you want high resonance for choirs, but high resonance doesn't make the spoken word understandable very well. But it seems that in the Thessaloniki churches, they could, from the amber, have a different resonance than in the nave where the choir was. So the practical requirements of church sacred art, if you're an architect, you've got to be good acoustics. Ideally, use natural materials, or keep kind of rather mechanical materials of concrete to minimum if all possible. And literally, the spaces should be usable for liturgical ritual. Metropolitan Callistos, of blessed memory, said that he celebrated a liturgy in Frank Lloyd Wright's Catholic Orthodox Church. Sorry, and he said it was terrible, it didn't work at all. It wasn't designed with the liturgy in mind. It was just a fancy of hubris, really, just doing something more for himself, Frank Lloyd Wright, than for the liturgy. Likewise, panel icons. What are their roles? The most obvious one is in icon screens. This is an icon screen I made for our church. So icons we associate particularly with the icon screen, but also, as you know, they're brought out on the feast day. Here they're venerating the icon of the feast day. Also, of course, icons are processed. They're not just sort of static objects. So this is the Portatus icon at Veron. By tradition, it came to the monastery on Tuesday, Bright Tuesday after Easter. So every Bright Tuesday, it's processed all around outside. And it struck me that, and if you've ever been to Greece or Russia or an Orthodox country, you see icons everywhere, don't you? On the taxis and on the street sides and all over the place. So it makes you realize that through the icon, you're reminded that every place is suitable for prayer. I was asked by the King Charles III to design this embroidered screen here for his coronation. The high point of the coronation is his anointing. That's when he's sort of made spiritually a king. The Holy Spirit comes upon the person. So that's a sacred time, so it wasn't going to be exposed to the television, really. So I was asked to design this. And the point is that it had to act in two ways. It had to symbolize what the anointing was and symbolize what a king does. But also it had to be used to cover him. So it was processed out, placed around him, and taken away. So it had to be light enough to be carried, had to be big enough, and the colors had to fit in with everything around. So that was a real joy to do. And symbolically, at the bottom, you have what's called the cipher. That's a symbol of the king. But he's at the base of the tree. He's there to serve the people above him. So liturgical art works symbolically, but also practically. It's got a function. Icons, of course, are worn. That's inculpin I made for Bishop Callistos. He's wore on his body. You have it in vehicles. This is a roadside shrine here. So I'd like to finish just with this wonderful vision that Ezekiel had, and I think this is everything about liturgical art. He says, "I saw water coming up from under the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar. When the river empties into the sea, the salty water there becomes fresh. Swarms of living creatures will live wherever the river flows. There will be large numbers of fish because this water flows there and makes the salt water fresh. So where the river flows, everything will live." So to say you've got this little thing, this tiny altar in the temple, and that's where it all begins. You know, God comes down to earth. But God it's not a sort of a fountain where the water goes up and comes down again, but it spreads out. It becomes a little river at first, and Ezekiel says that he went into the river. In the beginning, it was just sort of ankle deep, and he goes further down, and it's sort of up to his knees or something, and he goes further down. It gets deeper and deeper and bigger. So liturgical art, you know, is normally a small thing, but the effect over the centuries, quantitatively, and the effect on individuals' lives qualitatively is enormous. So I think, though in one sense we've had a revival of iconography as Orthodox, I think we're still at our very early stages. I don't think we really understood how profound liturgical art is. All the research, say, done on Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, it's astounding, the skill involved there. They've done research, for example, on the what's called the reveals around the base of the dome. You have lots of windows, and the windowsill, as it were, is at a certain angle. And they scanned the cathedral, and then they put it into a computer and adjusted the angles of the reveals. And they found that if you change the angles, either there's too much light reflected into the dome on the outside, or adjusted the other way, too much light in the center. But the angle they have is just perfect for the right reflection of light. So I'll turn the light and give it dark, aren't we? No, it's not right. I'll finish around. Sorry, it's getting dark here in England. Is that better? There we are. I've got a halo behind me. It's not a real one. So it's astounding how skillful they were at using light liturgically. So I think we've got a lot to learn. And my desire is that every Orthodox seminary, they have a really serious module on liturgical art, not just icons, because priests need to be able to brief people, an architect or whatever, what's needed. They can't tell the architect how to do it, but they can say, right, we need good acoustics, we need the light to do certain things, and so on and so forth. So I think our art will only be as good as the brief, as the higher the ceiling we set, the more that will inspire our liturgical artists, be the iconographers or musicians. Well, thank you very much indeed. Perhaps we can have some questions now.
Yes, thank you so much. Please, anyone who has questions, now is the time to ask. Yes, Laura.
So I have quite a few questions, so I hope you can bear with me. My first question is, how do you kind of see the role of the congregation in the symphony of the arts in the church, like as kind of maybe like living artworks? I kind of like to think about how God is the master artist and he's constantly working on us. But I want to hear your insight into the congregation.
Well, of course, that's been trying to say that it is a symphony, and everyone is involved in that symphony. We're not there as spectators, are we? Just to sort of watch everything happening up front. So singing, I think congregational singing helps a lot, but we have that in our church. Especially the liturgy, most of it's repeated, isn't it? Matins and Vespers is a bit different. So that's important. Obviously, basic things like making the sign of the cross, venerating the icons, lighting candles, those are very active physical things. But we ought not to limit the liturgy just to those 2-3 hours on a Sunday. That liturgy, as in Ezekiel's vision, flows out. So, when you have a philoptikos or whatever that helps the poor during the week, that's an extension of the liturgy. It's not, you've got the Holy Liturgy and then everything else is just, the days of the week doing your own thing. See, all that work we do during the week, if you're a teacher or street cleaner or cook, all that should be actually part of our life with Christ. And it's moving toward the liturgy. St. Seraphim of Seraph said that every good work done out of love for God helps us to acquire the Spirit. And he said that a good work done for its own sake is good, but it won't acquire for us the Spirit in the same way. In other words, he's saying that everything be directed toward the East, as it were, directed toward deification. And the other way around, let the union we're experienced in the Holy Liturgy inspire what we do in the coming week. So I think that's part of the symphony. So I don't think we can limit liturgical art just to painting icons. So when you're preparing the phosphora, that in itself is a skill and it's an act. Making the wine, but we offer wine, of course. We don't offer grape juice. We don't offer wheat. We offer bread. And there are many different types of liturgical art. So some people can't paint really well, they never will, but they can be great at embroidery or metalwork or carpentry. so on. I don't know if that answers your question, Laura, but
It definitely does. What was the name of the saint from the last quote you mentioned? Like the every good work.
that's Saint Seraphim of Sarof.
It's here.
The conversation you had with Nicholas Motovilov, who was a layman, we were standing outside in the snow, and Seraphim said, "The Lord's revealed to me, Nicholas, that from your childhood you've been seeking the aim of the Christian life, and no one's given you a satisfactory answer. Well, I, poor Seraphim, will tell you." And he said it's to acquire the Holy Spirit. And he said that my father was a merchant, so his job was to make money. So whatever he sold, the aim was to make money. So likewise, the Christian, you can't buy the Holy Spirit, of course, but he was saying that we do everything out of love for God so that we can get closer to God. And then they had this conversation, and it carries on. And then Seraphim says to Nicholas, "Well, why aren't you looking at me?" And Nicholas said, "I can't, because you're shining like the sun." And then Seraphim says, "Well, you too are shining like the sun. I asked the Lord to show you how we know if we're in the Spirit or not. And you can only see me transfigured because you too are transfigured." And the conversation carries on. And Nicholas wrote all this down. It's a wonderful conversation. Have you come across it, Laura? Have you read the
No, but I've had it recommended to me, so I think I should check it out.
yeah, it's a small book called Conversations with Saint Seraphim. That's been republished, I think, under different titles. But yeah, it's about, I don't know, about 20 pages long. It's a short thing, but you know, it says everything really.
I also have two sort of practical questions and one other more theological one. But if someone else wants to ask a question first, maybe. So I'm not taking up all of the Q&A.
Hi, Maggie. It looks as though you've stopped your card. You're in your car, are you?
Yes. Yeah, there was traffic. I'm from Los Angeles and we just actually came to serve in a monastery. So I'm kind of feeling, this lecture within the space I'm in. But yes, I thank you so much for this lecture. My question is, I've recently attended a liturgy in a chapel where the icon program is across the walls. It is all four walls of the chapel. And I was wondering if you think there's any benefits to creating, the symphony of the liturgical arts across the walls where they're not limited by frames, or if there's something, more special about each saint or each person that we kind of are drawn towards when we're praying to be within, a specific frame where you can just focus on that while you're praying.
That's a really important question. I think there are two types of visual icon. They're the individual icons, where it's just you and the saint, that personal direct relationship. But then frescoes or mosaics over the whole wall, though of course it's made of individuals, that's like a single icon of the family of the saints. So of course you can look at individual ones, and one does, but when you go into a church that's completely frescoed, you're first aware, wow, I've entered the heavenly Jerusalem here, the city. So it's a single icon of the New Jerusalem. The downside of having lots of individual framed icons is that you're just aware more of the individuals, not so much of the unity, which is the main reason why you have frescoes where there might be some partition between the figures, but often there aren't any partitions. So you might have a whole row of saints without any frames. You often have delineations horizontally, because you might have the life of Christ above and down below the martyrs. You've got some division there, but between the saints, you don't often have partitions because it is more them as a unity. But it depends on the place, doesn't it? Like wooden churches, you can't fresco those, so there you just have lots of individual icons. So it depends again on the place. You've got to do something that's authentic to that particular place, I think. I don't know if that answers your question, maybe.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Lydia has a question in the chat. Do you have any recommendations of where one can start studying about Orthodox architecture?
About 2 years ago, I was approached by, this is not exactly answering your question, but it's acknowledging that it was a real need. I was approached 2 years ago by Chichester Cathedral. It's an Anglican ancient cathedral, actually founded in Orthodox times, about how to start a liturgical arts centre. So that started about 2 years ago. So one of the things we're gradually working toward is having short-term apprenticeships and long-term ones. But one thing I want to develop is, say, perhaps a month-long course or something like that on church architecture, particularly Orthodox Church architecture in our case. So architects who have done all their normal secular study and got their letters and can then have a supplementary pill, a sort of a vitamin pill, a supplementary instruction on the particular theology and the liturgical demands of Orthodox churches. As far as I know, there's nothing like that in America or Britain, sadly, because the very specific demands of Orthodox worship and theology and ethos that require that. But if I were to recommend anyone, it would certainly be Andrew Gold. I mean, he's a brilliant architect. I think he's got the aesthetic sense. He's got a broad knowledge of architecture across the world. And he believes that each work of architecture should be rooted in the locality and in that culture. So that if you looked at his churches around America, they're always responding to the local architecture, not just America in general, but that particular state. So really, I think the only way at the moment is, apart from reading, and some great stuff, research has been done. I just mentioned a few of them in the talk, sort of more scientific analysis of traditional churches. You can glean a lot from those, you know, what secrets were they behind their success, proportion, materials, acoustics. I read an interesting article by a NASA engineer who's Orthodox, where he analysed some of the elements that make for good acoustics. But personally, if I were an architect and I wanted to learn more about Orthodox architecture, I'd go to someone like Andrew or some architect I really respected, and I sort of sit at their feet and pester them.
Should start your apprenticeship, Lydia.
Yeah, I believe
Yeah,
it.
Lydia's an architect. She's
Sorry?
studying architecture formally. Lydia's studying architecture formally, so she's her goal is to make churches one day.
Well, I think yeah, find out what research has already been done, and there's been really good cooperative work being done between different disciplines, like Alexander Lingus, for example, a Byzantinologist. He's been working with computer boss who can, as it were, measure the resonance of churches, and then Alexander's choir sings in a dead space, studio space, and then they put all that to the computer and add the resonance. But then other people figured out how that resonance was obtained. So looking back, we can learn the secrets of the past and then apply them to the future. So I think I'd love it if a lot of this individual discovery, sort of dotted all over academic pages, could actually be brought into one place. So it's more readily accessible. At the moment, we've got to sort of search all over the place and hope for the best. But I'm glad to say that more work has been done on this. But it's not enough to show up to a lovely church. Well, why is it good? You know, these people knew what they're doing and they consistently got it right. So there must have been principles that they understood. I'd imagine, I don't know about Greece, if there's sort of, there must be some sort of Orthodox architectural study there to sort of top up one's ordinary sort of secular training. I don't know, but I would hope so. But all being Greek, of course. Laura, you heard some other questions, did you? You were probably waiting for the others.
Sure. So other kind of theological question is, I'm really interested in doing research into children's role in liturgical arts. And, you know, Christ said, let the little children come to me, but you don't see the world. I often see that children are really allowed to create liturgical art or participate your thoughts on the topic.
Laura, is that on your end?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Failing.
I'll take off share, stop share. Yeah, that's better.
I think your mic was.
That's fine now. Yeah. That's good. Yes. I can't hear now, Laura.
Now we just can't hear. I think your mic just failed. If you want to maybe type out your question in chat. Sorry.
Yes, but Laura started to talk about the relationship between children's art and iconography. I actually met a Serbian lady doing a doctorate precisely on that, and she found there's a strong correspondence between children's art and iconography. And I think the link is that children draw, paint things, sculpt things, have experienced them. Like if they draw a picture of their mother or father, the heads, the faces are normally big because that's the most important thing. The main experience is the person of their mother and father. The danger is that as we grow up, we sort of become slaves of our physical lives, and we cease to depict things as we experience them. We think, well, we've got to depict them photographically. And in this sense, I think so-called primitive art is actually much more civilized in much higher level than our Renaissance art. Renaissance art, we could say it's technically accomplished, but they said the Italian Renaissance that man is the measure of all things. They forgot the invisible realities. But children, experience things and they depict things how they experience things. So this is why iconography uses the abstracts means that it does, because it gets below the surface of things. So that icon, for example, of Moses receiving the law, you'll never see a mountain like that or a tree like that, but that's how a mountain is. A mountain is made by God to sort of draw us closer to him. So yeah, I think well, Picasso said that all my life I've been trying to paint like a child again, not childishly, but to see and experience the world as a child. The wonder of it all, the freshness of it all.
Does that answer your question, Laura? Very good. Vika has, I think, a really interesting question. I think today, with the increased availability of sacred objects such as icons, it might be easier to lose reverence for them. Do you have any thoughts on the connection between sanctity and scarcity? How to not lose ourselves and God in all this abundance?
Ah, good point. We certainly need to be woken up. And I think that because we, in a sense, didn't lose the icon tradition, but it became rather debased, there's the danger that to regain the tradition, we end up just copying. Then I think you can fall asleep and lose that sense of awareness of it, because we're saying the same icon, badly copied normally again and again. The living icon tradition has always got something fresh and a bit different that sort of wakes you up. Like as a musician, you've probably heard many variations on the same work. Vivaldi's Four Seasons played in different ways, and it keeps you afresh. So I think if the icon and the whole liturgical art tradition is alive, we say the same thing in a slightly different way. But if we're just copying, then I think we can fall asleep, as it were, and lose sight of the abundance of it. Like every season is different. God made the seasons that repeat, but no season is the same. So I think our liturgical art should be the same. So that's why with my students, I say, well, in the beginning, I'm going to need you to copy to understand the timeless principles. But the whole idea is not you end up copying all your life, but so you can discover the secrets of the masters. And then you've got to then respond to the commissioner, or lighting in your church, all sorts of things, and make something appropriate to that. So your work will end up being a bit different, not because you're out there to sort of make it different for different sake, but if you respond to a particular place and person, then there'll be a freshness to it. And people think, wow, I've never seen or heard they're put in that way, and that keeps us with that childlike wonder and awareness. I don't know if that helps answer your question. And Alex?
Hello, I have a follow-up question on this. So I would consider myself an amateur iconographer. I have an iconography instructor, and I've been doing it for a few years now. But the question is regarding this slight introduction of novelty into icons, especially when you're first learning. It's when your teacher is strict, we'll say. It's you're really not allowed to introduce your own styles into things, because who are you to change this prototypical icon? So like, at what stage are you able to say, okay, I have now accomplished the fundamentals and I'm going to introduce to the world my version of this icon?
It's a good question. It just depends on the gift of the person, really. So I take on 12 students over 3 years, and out of that 12, you might get one who has never been got, they're just sort of tone deaf, but you might get one who in 1 year is always ready to accept commissions. You know, they just got the eye, and you can let them loose a bit earlier. So it depends on how quick they are to learn those principles and those skills. Some people I've known among my students, they're naturally quite free, and I've got to rein them in a bit to learn discipline. Others the other way, they're a bit too tight, they're afraid, so they'll be happy if they're copied for the rest of their lives. So I've got to free them up a bit to show that the tradition shouldn't be dominated by fear. You should have respect, but not fear. So how do you know if you're ready? I think it's up to your teacher. I must say that I'm afraid some teachers do consider the icon tradition just endless copying, and I don't think that's traditional. It's a good beginning. When we copy icons in the first year, I say, well, you're not copying just like a machine. You're just like an archaeologist. You're digging to find the stuff below the surface. That's what you're looking for, those principles. Then you can forget, the icon you copied, it's those principles. So I think, how do you know when you're ready? I can't really, that's a difficult question to answer, but I think you should never set out to do your own icon, all right? The whole idea isn't self-expression, it's expression of Christ. It'll happen naturally. Like people say they can recognize my icon straight away, but I never set out to make an icon, to express Aidan Hart. I'm just responding to the church, the individual, or whatever it is. So I think changes happen by small iterations. My book, Festal Icons, I've had published recently. It's fascinating researching for the development of each festal icon. Very rarely were there big changes. There's little changes here and there gradually over 3, 5, 6 centuries. You realize actually they changed a lot, but it was just by little iterations, trial and error. I think you know within yourself, if you're a humble person and you want to serve Christ, you sort of know when you can sort of adjust a bit. But normally it's just a practical need. Like, if you are commissioned to do an icon 3 feet by 1 foot, you can't just sort of get an icon that's designed to be 3 foot by 2 foot and just lop it off. So you've got to design a new one. You'll draw on other ones, but normally it's just practical considerations that compel you to design something that's fresh. It's not that you set out to do it. I've done a lot of the first icons of British saints, Orthodox saints, so there weren't any other icons around, so I just had to design something new in inverted commas.
Thank you. And just another brief technical question that I'm curious about. When you instruct your students in painting, do you first prefer they have a foundation in drawing too? Do you see that drawing is important?
Yeah, the first, we have a 3-year course, and the first year is just monochrome. Not so much pencil drawing. The very first course I started in 2009, we did pencil drawings, but then I dropped that fairly quickly, just working with monochrome. So that's some watercolor paper with one color, like red ochre. So you learn the actual brush skills as well at the same time as learning form. Funnily enough, it's garments that most people fail at. I've seen icons with good faces, but the garments are terrible. I think it's actually heretical, not that it's promoted as heresy, but some writing about icons say, oh, they're spiritual because they dematerialize. No, that's wrong. You know, the matter is good. So likewise with garments, you've got to understand the form of the garment to know how to simplify it. Constantine Brancusi, the Romanian sculptor, he said that simplicity is complexity resolved. Simplicity is complexity resolved. So I tend to have my students paint icons by Father Zenon, Theodore, because his garments are very well articulated. But because they're contemporary icons in good condition, for one thing, you can have a masterpiece, but it's been knocked around, so you can't really see it very well. But his are really, really well painted, but also because they're new, they're in good condition. So they're really well articulated. So by doing monochromes of those, they can then, over a few years of practice, know how to simplify. Or if they see, say, a Moscow icon of very sort of simple linear folds, they know what that means. But if people go straight into just doing garments with simple lines, they'll fail if they don't understand the form that those lines are simplification of. So I certainly recommend people do at least a year monochrome studies, which is drawing effectively, the drawing with paint.
Thanks so much.
Maggie.
So, so I study liturgical and biblical manuscript illustration, and I was wondering if this tradition were to ever, I guess begin again as it used to be in the in the medieval times. Do you think, especially with liturgical books, would it aid in this process of, focusing, the religiosity of the experience when you're within, Vespers or liturgy or praises? Or do you think because each page would be so intricate in its designs that you would be too distracted by what you're looking at to focus on, the prayers that you're meant to be partaking in?
That's a very good question. I think any embellishment needs to be appropriate for its function. So I agree that if it is too ornate, it could distract you. But on the other hand, some ornamentation and some figurative work can make the chanters more aware of the sacredness of this, that they're not just mouthing words, they're actually in words doing what images do. They're presenting people, presenting saints with a state of soul. There's some incredible illuminated manuscripts dated about 1000 in really good condition, probably painted in Constantinople. And it has the 4 evangelists, and there would have been at the beginning of the Gospels. And each one of those brings out the character of that particular evangelist. St. Mark, for example, he often uses the words, suddenly, of course, did this and he rushed there and went there, very sort of active. So Mark is actually very sort of got a dynamic contrabasso pose. John, the mystic, is much more sort of still. So the way they depicted those saints actually reflects their, as it were, the character, the emphasis in the gospel. So if I were, if I were a priest reading the gospel, I would see that picture and actually inspire me, to understand more deeply what I was reading out. So I think, well, the church has done it for centuries, so there must have been good reason to do it. The church doesn't do things a long time if it's going to be damaging. Of course, with printing now, we can get one person to illustrate a book, and then you can print it. So I think there's a real place for that. In fact, on Tuesday, I'm going to London to receive an award for the St. John's Bible. Have you heard of the St. John's Bible?
Yes.
Yeah, so the people involved in making it are receiving the Pax Christi Award, and that's been one of the few Bibles done in full in hand, but with illustrations. And that's had an enormous effect. It's been toured around. I mean, it's Catholic and it's got more sort of modern stuff, but the whole idea is trying to illuminate the content of the pages in which those illustrations are. No, I think it's a good thing to do.
Thank you.
Do you do calligraphy or illustration yourself, Maggie?
I took one course because I focus more on illumination than illustration. I'm looking at Coptic manuscripts in the Red Sea, so there's a lot of work to be done there, especially in St. Paul's. but yeah, I not to the extent that I would like to do illustration.
Very good. Anyone else? Ah, Laura. Okay, very good. Laura asks, if you're a bit more of a free spirit and you need more discipline, how can you discipline yourself, especially if you're used to making art for self-expression?
That's a good point, Laura. I think the two legitimate forms of art that an Orthodox or any devout Christian can follow, one is liturgical art, and just by its nature, there are smaller parameters for that. But then there's art with what I've dubbed threshold art. So this is made by artists who have a strong faith, but for whatever reason, they feel called more to sort of be out in the world and convey some of the spirit of life with Christ, not usually, in fact, by depicting religious subjects, but the way they depict a face or a tree, whatever, can convey something of a worldview which is inspired by Christ. So there's some people who I think just naturally just got that effervescence and they'd be uncomfortable with the restrictions for liturgical art. But if one does really want to do liturgical art and one has this free spirit, I think, as with all things music and all things, you need the skill and the vocabulary and the grammar to express yourself fully. So I think if one has that natural freedom, which is a fantastic thing, Theophan the Greek had it. I don't know if you know the works of Theophan the Greek, Laura, but he was a great iconographer who did lots of frescoes and gradually moved from Constantinople toward Russia. And in Novgorod, he painted these amazing frescoes of, not many remained, but we have the Holy Trinity icon and the three stylites on pillars. And these are painted, probably these stylites, each were painted up, my guess, in about 3 hours, just with red, white, and black. They're like sort of sacred cartoons. And we have descriptions of Theophan. It's unusual to have such contemporary, vivid descriptions. And his friend said, unlike our Russian painters, Theophan doesn't always sort of look at his copybook there. He paints directly onto the wall. But while he's painting on the wall, he converses on philosophical things with all the crowds that have gathered to watch him, while his mind is aloft contemplating heavenly realities, while his feet are going hither and thither. And there's actually a limited manuscript showing him there up on the scaffolding with all these people standing agog looking at him. And so he had this great feeling. He's so much inside the tradition that he could be free. It's like, yeah, for most of us, it's like a second language we've learned. We've got to be sort of careful about grammar. But if it's your first language, you can be free in your expression. So I think hard work actually frees you up because it becomes your first language then, and then you can relax a bit and you know, even Fotis Conteglu, who revived contemporary Greek iconography. I mean, he was quite a sort of a zealot, but in fact, there's quite a bit of freedom in his work. And the people like the number of Romanian iconographers, you know, who are experimenting with freer styles of iconography. They're all really skilled. Some, I think, go a bit too much into what I call threshold art. You know, there's art that was fine for the gallery, but not for the church. But others are doing things which want to be very comfortable playing in front of, but they're not just copying what was before. So I think, yeah, study hard, study the masters with the mind becoming freer through having learned those crafts. Like if you want to be a great violinist, you've got to do your scales, and the better your scales are, the freer you'll be.
Phenomenal. Anyone else? Any last lingering questions?
So about the quality of my lighting up here. I'm going to have us gradually disappearing into the dark, and it's rather strange lighting. This one light, all the bulbs are gone. I think I'm using my son's bedroom.
Very good. It's getting a bit late, I would imagine, but okay. Well, if no one else has any questions, if someone else thinks of something, may we potentially give them your email or a way to contact.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, with that, thank you very much, Mr. Hart, and
Thank you,
thank you for taking the time.
everyone. Thank you for taking the time out, and I hope we've all learned something. I've certainly learned a lot from your questions. So
Yeah.
perhaps one day I can visit you all in wonderful Boston.
Oh, that'd be so wonderful. We could have you do a gambit of speaking perhaps and such things, and then get many people to come and see. That'd be so lovely.
All right then. Enjoy time in the monastery, Maggie.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right then. Pray
Bye.
for me this minute. Bye bye. Bye bye, Alex.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much.